Hello, this is Jay Rogers. I am the director of the Forerunner, and in this video, I want to go over an article that I wrote recently. I'll just pull it up on the screen here. This is called "The Russia-Ukraine Conflict Was Provoked," and I was inspired by this article here, or this book by Scott Horton called "Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine." So if you've seen this channel or if you've read any of my articles on the Forerunner, you know that from the beginning, my view has been that even though I'm anti-war, I don't want the war to go on for another minute in Ukraine. I think that the lion's share of the blame lies with the West. So I just want to go through the article and I want to click on some of the links. I want to make a case. And so hopefully we'll get through this in a few minutes here. Okay, so first of all, in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, the legacy media made it obligatory to include in any news presentation the phrases Vladimir Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine was always described as a sovereign democratic nation. So this is just some examples of this. You see the number of times, let's see, what's the total here? But there's literally, you could probably find, hundreds of articles, if not thousands of articles, with some variation of that thing. Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, or something like that. This is just a few examples that I pulled up here. Another popular phrase is that Ukraine is always described as a sovereign democratic nation. So it's just interesting that um, it's been 2 years since Russia launched its, full-scale invasions, probably. This isn't just about Ukraine's ability to remain a sovereign democratic nation. So those are repeated over and over again, as you can see in these Google searches. And it's interesting because it's that exact string of words, and that's in hundreds of articles. It's almost as though it was coordinated or, demanded by some higher power. And so these are phrases that are used even till today. So what you have to understand is repetition in propaganda is a very subtle form of brainwashing. And it something that's universally repeated thousands of times over, not challenged, very soon it becomes part of the narrative and people are unable to refute it. So, and I tried to do this in the beginning, but I just thought it was useful to review some of this. So first of all, is Ukraine free and democratic? Okay, so almost always people insist that Ukraine is a sovereign democracy, sometimes a free democracy. Now, I will say this, Ukraine could be a victim of the West. Ukraine could be a victim of Russia, but it doesn't mean that just because Ukraine is the victim that it's free and democratic. Those two things are separate, okay? So even if we want to put Ukraine in the role of the victim, it's disingenuous to say that that automatically means that they were a free democratic nation. Um, Up until the conflict in 2022, Ukraine was often characterized as one of the most corrupt nations in Europe, run by oligarchs who funneled billions of dollars of graft back and forth between Western billionaires and politicians. So one example of this is 2015, The Guardian called Ukraine the most, oops, what happened there? I have a wrong link there, but there is an article in the Guardian which calls Ukraine the most corrupt nation in Europe. Let me see if I can just real quickly find the correct link there. Oops. Okay, so here we go. Welcome to Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. And this just goes through and it chronicles all the things. And the interesting thing about this article is that Russia and the pro-Russian separatist movement in Donbass, which was a war going on even then, it's mentioned only once in the article. So according to another poll conducted by Ernst & Young in 2017, experts considered Ukraine to be the ninth most corrupt nation from 53 surveyed. Yes, the ninth most corrupt, even ahead of Russia and ahead of a few other nations. So you see here, we've got Brazil, Colombia, etc. Down here at number 9 is Ukraine. And then if you go all the way down to number 29, we'll find the UK, and then Turkey, then Canada, then Russia. And then shortly after that, the USA, and then China at number 40. After, so it's just kind of interesting how the world has changed. Almost universally now, we're going to put Russia and China at the top, but it's mainly political, obviously. Okay. So there's different examples of this that people know about. We know about the Hunter Biden Burisma scandal, um, and this is the report from the U.S. House Oversight Committee. You can read that. And then there's also the fact that there's millions of dollars that were donated to the Clinton Foundation from a Ukrainian oligarch. And again, this might be legal, but it's questionable because, why are these, leaders, Hillary Clinton was about to run for president there. Why is she receiving millions of dollars? I think it's tens of millions actually in this article. But anyway, that's behind a paywall, unfortunately. Um, and then so it's kind of questionable, right? It's at least questionable. If it's not illegal, it's questionable. And this is the tip of the iceberg. I think that it's very unlikely that we're going to get any indictments or any further investigations. Why? Well, because Republicans do it too. So just for fair, you know, just as a disclaimer here, the Trump Foundation also took donations from the same donor, not as much as the Clinton. It was only less than $1 million, and the Clinton Foundation took millions and millions. And that's only what's on the surface. That's only what's disclosed. We don't know about anything that's done behind closed doors and things like that. Okay, so let's talk about this. So is Ukraine a sovereign democracy? Well, Ukraine is a country since 1991 that's been run by oligarchs, particularly about 7 oligarchs that have funneled a lot of money into presidential campaigns. And then even Western governments have funneled money into campaigns to make sure that the government was either pro-Western and so on. So I don't consider Ukraine to be a sovereign nation, and it's certainly not democratic. As of right now, all of the opposition parties to any of the Euromaidan parties are the parties that agree that with Zelensky's government, essentially. So the opposition parties, the pro-Russian parties, the people that opposed Euromaidan back in 2014 are illegal. All right. Also, elections were suspended back in March because Ukraine's under martial law. So the current Ukrainian parliament, called the Rada, and Vladimir Zelensky, or Volodymyr Zelensky, as his name is known in Ukrainian. He's actually a Russian Jew, but he's adopted the name Volodymyr. He is not standing for election again. He should have been reelected in March, or stood for reelection in March. He did not. So we have to ask, is it a democratic nation if they don't have elections for the foreseeable future? Also, Vladimir Putin is conducting a war. He stood for election. He won with about 80%. So and there were opposition parties running against him. So that's kind of disingenuous as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so what about Putin's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Well, this was the most common piece that you hear, the lie that the military conflict was completely unprovoked. And so I say that this is disingenuous unless it fully examines the decade-old conflict in the Donbass, funded by the US and NATO since 2014. So in other words, Russian separatists wanted to split off of Ukraine back in 2014, and the US and NATO have been funding militias and regular military troops from Ukraine that have been fighting in the Donbass since that time for over 10 years. And so contributing to that are the numerous stories chronicling, contributing to this media hypocrisy are its numerous stories chronicling overtures to Ukraine from the West since 2008 that it must become part of NATO. So since 2008, George Bush and other presidents have been pushing Ukraine to join NATO. And then even more recently, people have said that Ukraine must seek nuclear weapons. Okay, if you look at where Ukraine is in relation to Russia, that they would take back Crimea, they put nuclear weapons there, they put nuclear weapons in the Donbass along Russia's border and so on. So that basically would negate Russia as a major power. It would not have access to the Black Sea in case of a war and so on. And there would be nuclear weapons just minutes away from Moscow. So there's different people that are going to, debate this and say that, well, so what? Ukraine can join any alliance it wants to. It's a free sovereign democracy after all. But, would we want missiles in Cuba pointing at us? Well, no, history shows us no. We wouldn't want Cuba, we wouldn't want Canada turned against us or Mexico turned against us and have, Chinese or Iranian or even Russian military bases just over our border with missiles pointed just a few minutes away from Washington, D.C. and our major cities. Okay, so anyway, there are numerous articles also from this time that were somewhat sympathetic or at least neutral toward these separatists in Donbass, these pro-Russians that wanted to secede from Ukraine. And there was also critical yet fair coverage of the secession referendums. It was reported that Putin continually refused both of these regions' appeals to join Russia. So if Russia just wants to grab pieces of Ukraine, the question is, why didn't they do it back in 2014 when the governments of these local oblasts were asking Russia to do that? Okay, so there are numerous articles from this time giving evidence that the conflict could have been provoked by a party other than Russia or Putin. It's possible that, Russia or Putin provoked it, but they also show other evidence. Here is one, what I call a fair or neutral article. It's not pro-Russian, it's not pro-Ukrainian. It's just an article explaining what happened. So if you want to look at that, educate yourself on this. Rebels appeal to join Russia after East Ukraine referendum. And that was back in May 13th of 2014. But Russia refused up until the fall of 2024. So I have to give a caveat here, okay? Causation does not imply justification. In other words, you can be against the war, you can be against Russia, you can be against anyone you want, you can hate Putin, whatever, but you can still want it to come to a speedy end without justifying the invasion. You don't have to say like, Russia should have invaded, they had the right to invade or whatever. But what we're saying here is that the lion's share of the blame for provoking the war is actually due to the US and NATO's policy of encroaching on the Russian Federation's borders. So this is from an internet friend, Andy Howder. I've kind of known him online for quite a time. He's written some very good analysis. I just want to briefly run through this. And what he says is, a fair analysis of the Russia-Ukraine conflict must consider how US and NATO interference has instigated the conflict and rejected viable paths to peace, while raising serious questions about the moral legitimacy of their involvement. Whatever you might think about the actions of the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin, you have to look at the Ukraine conflict from a biblically moral perspective. Okay? I'm kind of editing as I go here so I don't forget. But of the Russian Federation, there we go. This will be published in a few days. I'm just kind of going over it with you now. And I really like the way this article came out. So I'm going to read Andy Howder's points, and I'm going to try to summarize where I can. Russia's attempt at peaceful negotiation, which deserve more credit than given in Western narratives, or deserve more. Got to fix that too. This context is critical to a fair assessment of Russia's actions, especially in light of the violations of the Minsk agreements and the rejection of peace talks by Ukraine, often under the influence of Western powers. So the Minsk agreements are very controversial. There's different versions of what happened, but we're going to try to just go through this. And I put a couple of articles at the end, which are kind of give another view. This is a little bit different than what Andy Howder is saying, but I think that the version that Andy Howder is giving is correct. But I do at the end of this, I give another article down below. Okay, but we believe that Russia's attempts at peaceful negotiations do deserve more credit than the media is giving. Okay. All right, so the Minsk agreements were a set of talks and accords that were negotiated in 2014 and 2015, and they were designed to de-escalate the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So the agreements included commitments from all sides. First, a ceasefire, immediate cessation of hostilities, withdrawal, removal of heavy weapons from the front line, and then autonomy for Donbass. So Donetsk and Lugansk regions would get special status within Ukraine. Then there would be political reforms or constitutional changes in Ukraine to try and greater autonomy for these regions. Let me explain that a little bit. Autonomy basically here means federalism, which is like the people in Donbass would have the right to elect their own officials. As of right now, all regions throughout Ukraine have local governors appointed by Kiev. So these are like anti-Russian governors being appointed in Russian areas. And the policy is, anti-Russian language. For instance, you're not allowed to conduct business in Russian. You can speak Russian in public, obviously, because everyone there speaks Russian. But in official documents, in the media, Russian is the language that you need to know. Ukrainian is the language that you need to know. Also, Russian language schools are basically banned in these places. So people want to be able to raise their kids with the Russian language, preserve their Russian culture, and that's being met with hostility. Even as far as saying that, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Pushkin, the great Russian writers, can't be taught in Ukrainian schools in the Russian language. Tchaikovsky, even a performance by Tchaikovsky, which includes no Russian, is banned in Ukraine, things like that. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has ties to the Moscow Patriarch, is banned in Ukraine in favor of a new church that they started. So these are all laws that people find offensive, and that made them want to secede from Ukraine. So the constitutional changes would basically say that these regions can govern themselves and they can have any language they want, they can elect their own people, and so on. So it would be a greater degree of autonomy than what they have right now, kind of like federalism in the United States, like we elect our own local representatives. Okay, there are certain violations of the Minsk agreements on both sides. Both sides, Russia, Ukraine, and the separatists all bear some responsibility for violations. Evidence suggests that Ukraine consistently delayed the implementing of political reforms. And then Western leaders have since admitted that the agreements were largely a stalling tactic to buy Ukraine time to strengthen its military. Poroshenko, who was the president of Ukraine then, and also Angela Merkel, who is the Chancellor of Germany, and the French President Macron all admitted that. Or there was a politician in France, but all the countries involved in negotiating the accords have admitted that they were done as a stalling tactic. We need to arm Ukraine so we can drive the separatists out. The NATO nations, rather than pressuring Ukraine to comply with Minsk, NATO countries, particularly in US and Britain, supported Ukraine's military buildup and defensive operations, undermining the agreements. Russia, for its part, consistently cited Ukraine's non-compliance and Western interference as evidence that peaceful resolutions were being sabotaged. Now, I would also say that Russia refused to withdraw its advisors, and the separatists refused to withdraw their troops from the front lines. And there was like sniping and smaller exchanges that went on all during this time. So one side says, well, we're not going to do elections until you withdraw your troops. The other side says, well, we need to have elections, otherwise we're not secure and we need to have troops there. So that was not in the agreements, the order that it could have happened. So they're flawed. And I posted an article down the bottom that shows how the agreements were flawed. But the point is that later on, Western leaders said that we never intended on keeping them. They literally have said that. There were the Istanbul talks and peace talks in Turkey in March 2022. Russia and Ukraine engaged in peace talks, first in Minsk again, but then also in Turkey. These were facilitated by President Erdogan, and reports indicate that Russia presented terms for peace, including Ukrainian neutrality, which is no NATO membership, and the recognition of Crimea. Okay, and I have to fix this, because recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, but the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk as autonomous. That's an edit I need to make. But in the beginning, it's very important to understand that there was no push to make these, like Ukraine could have held on to its territories up until this time. So Ukraine initially showed interest in negotiating, particularly around the issue of neutrality. However, these talks fell apart due to Western meddling. On Britain's part, Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kiev and strongly discouraged Ukraine from accepting the terms, urging continued resistance. The United States provided massive military and financial aid to Ukraine, signaling its intent to prolong the conflict rather than support the settlement. So all during that time, they were just ramping up the military support. The rejection of peace talks underscores the extent to which the U.S. and its allies have prioritized their geopolitical goals over a peaceful resolution, effectively discouraging Ukraine from pursuing negotiations that would have definitely prevented devastation that has occurred. Also, Russia's willingness to engage in negotiations, both through the Minsk agreements and Istanbul peace talks, demonstrates it was pursuing just diplomatic avenues. Russia had a role in the agreements that showed its resolve to end the conflict peacefully. And Russia also came to the table with specific demands, which indicated a clear interest in avoiding military conflict. And Ukraine was actually very close and willing to agree until the West interfered. There are like 2 points about like how many troops could Ukraine keep in a what's the demilitarized zone going to be like? How many troops could Ukraine keep? What's the security agreement? That type of thing. That had not been decided yet, but those things were negotiable still. The main thing was that Ukraine was going to stay out of NATO and that the Donbas republics were going to go back to Ukraine, but as autonomous regions. When considering just war theory, last resort is a critical criterion. So Russia attempted peace for 8 years. And both the Minsk agreements and Istanbul talks suggest that Russia sought a non-military solution before escalating its military campaign. These efforts bolsters Russia's claims that it acted as a last resort after diplomacy failed. And like I said, this doesn't necessarily justify Russia's actions. You could still say that Russia was not justified because it didn't exhaust every last piece of, non-military intervention and negotiation, right? But at the same time, the Western sabotaged the agreements. So that shifts some of the moral responsibility for the continuation of the conflict onto U.S. and its allies. So if you're trying to conduct peace agreements and you're continually being sabotaged, and you're being sabotaged, and it's in the press that you're being sabotaged, then you can probably justify some type of military action. This does not mean that Russia's actions are above criticism, but Russia in general does not target civilians and generally wants Ukrainians to be restored. However, and that is true, Ukraine does not want to occupy Ukraine. And I know people disagree with that, but if you look at everything that Russia has done on the battlefield and everything that Putin has said, they don't want a dysfunctional rump state in Ukraine, and they also don't want to govern a large group of people who hate Russia either. It's illogical that they would want that. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It doesn't want to dominate the entire, Eastern European space. What it wants is a security for its borders, like all nations do. Okay. So there's been a repeated dismissal of diplomatic solutions by Ukraine and its Western backers. That must be acknowledged as the most significant factor in the war. Russia's attempts at peaceful negotiations, including the Minsk agreements and the Istanbul talks, show a willingness to negotiate that is often always overlooked in Western narratives. These efforts, undermined by NATO nations and Ukraine's intransigence, suggest that Russia's military actions are more defensible than under just war principles. Okay, so this is a balanced view of the Minsk agreements that you can read. And this is written by a Harvard-related person. It's kind of a liberal site, so you would not expect it to be very pro-Russian. And I just consider this to be a pretty good rundown of it and a criticism of why it fails. I don't agree with everything in the article, but it's good as a counterbalance to what you just read. And this is that article I showed you before, which is also worth understanding that for many years, this is like, for instance, here's your photo here, if it will come up. Anyway, this was a photo showing that this was one of the referendums here. And it was a multi-part referendum. One of them said, do you want to remain part of Ukraine but be autonomous? Another one is, do you want to secede? Another one was, do you want to join Russia? And they voted overwhelmingly in both oblasts to do that, to both secede and to join Russia. So anyway, that's the video. There's a lot of other things going on in Ukraine, of course. One of the things I want to do is come back in a couple of days and talk about what's happened on the battlefield since the time of the last video I did. And I'd also like to talk about this new wonder weapon that Russia has, the Oreshnik, which I believe is actually going to change security throughout the world. I actually have a very positive view of that, in that the United States can now be challenged and is going to be forced to keep out of conflicts because of this weapon. So it's not a nuclear, doesn't necessarily have to be a nuclear weapon, but it's a, it's a weapon that is a great deterrence, so on. So